Hey guys, tonight we embark on a mysterious journey into the Byzantine Empire, where one of history's most powerful emperors came face to face with supernatural wrath. Beneath the flickering lights of its sacred palaces, we'll uncover the story of Constantine V, the man who once boldly destroyed holy icons only to suffer a horrifying fate, immortalized by religious historians in chilling detail. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you live and your current local time. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the heroic annals of Byzantine history, Emperor Constantine V, also known as Kapranos, the dung-named emerges as a figure of profound contradiction, the destroyer of sacred icons who was utterly convinced he was carrying out God's own will. Born in the year 718 as the son of Leo III, Constantine was exposed from childhood to the iconoclastic doctrine his father had launched regarding the veneration of images of Christ and the saints as heretical, impeding the purity of faith. Even as a boy, he witnessed soldiers wielding iron hammers to shatter vibrant mosaics, heard the agonized screams of monks forced to kneel beneath the scourge, and retreated silently into the shadows. Those memories seared into his soul, convincing Constantine that only by erasing all sacred images could the empire be restored to the true path of belief. Upon reaching adulthood, Constantine's mind brooked no compromise in his eyes. Every depiction of Christ, the Virgin Mary, or the saints signified sin, luring the populace into superstition. When he ascended the throne in the year 740 Yorg, one at the age of 23, he was determined to prove himself worthy of his father's iconoclastic legacy. Before the realm could find calm, a revolt erupted. His brother-in-law Artabasdos led the iconophile faction, calling for the restoration of holy images and the re-establishment of religious liberty. The conflict swept across the land like a swift gale, fierce and merciless. Constantine ordered his forces to encircle the rebels, pursued every resistant column, and ultimately captured Artabasdos and his son. In the hippodrome's center, both were blinded, two pairs of eyes gouged out on the sands, lash echoes ringing like a chilling decree. Defy heaven's mandate, and this shall be your doom. Victory over Artabasdos paved the way for the fiercest iconoclastic campaign to date. In the year 754, Constantine convened the Council of Hira, proclaiming it the Church's seventh ecumenical council, though in truth it comprised only bishops loyal to the emperor's will. There, the veneration of images of Christ and the saints was officially condemned as heresy, and every religious artifact from mosaics and statues to illustrated manuscripts was ordered to be burned. Throughout Constantinople, clouds of white smoke rose from pyres of ashes, a ghostly testament to faith forcibly stolen. Believers were compelled to watch as objects once deemed holy were reduced to lifeless ruins, all under the rhetoric that this was the pure path the empire must follow. Immediately after the council, the engine of repression was unleashed across the empire. Ancient monasteries that had sheltered the souls of thousands of monks saw their lands seized, transformed into farms or military outposts. The most humiliating measure was the public mock weddings forced upon monks and nuns in the heart of the capital, turning their vows into a spectacle of ridicule. The cleansing incense of old was swept away by harsh winds, replaced by the echo of derision. Anyone caught sheltering an icon or hiding within a cloistered abbey faced chains, torture, or execution. Crowds gathered to watch, murmuring that divine justice was served, even as fear and hatred churned within their hearts. Amid the sea of blood and ash, a few steadfast souls held firm. Theologian Stephen the Younger, hair white as ashes and eyes blazing with conviction, became the emblem of the iconophile cause. Captured and shackled, he still cried out prayers and challenged the emperor. "I will not abandon the faith that sustains me." They say his fingernails were stripped bare. Yet his spirit remained as immovable as a rock. His cries echoed through dungeon corridors, inspiring even the weakest to believe that faith, though tormented, could never be crushed. At first, such brutality seemed to quash open resistance, but in truth it sowed seeds of deep-rooted hatred among the people. Beneath a thick veil of religious terror, the icon preservation movement sprang up in secret across the land. Believers hid icons behind false walls, carried fragments in their robes, and whispered prayers in the dead of night. Cloistered convents became underground sanctuaries where shards of holy images were exchanged to warm, aching hearts. The soft murmur of psalms beneath cold stone-vaulted ceilings became a beacon of hope in the overwhelming darkness. Thus, throughout the early years of his reign, Constantine V etched his name into history as the scourge of sacred imagery. Chronicles record an empire outwardly strong, yet inwardly torn faith and power entwined into a chaotic paradox. Whenever the wind moaned through those ancient halls, it carried the distant clang of hammer upon icon, a reminder that an act cloaked in righteousness today can unleash suffering for countless generations. In the heavy breaths of the night, the crumbling walls and embers of extinguished pyres whisper an eternal tale of power, faith, and unavoidable consequence. In the epic saga of Byzantium, Emperor Constantine V, derisively nicknamed Kapronos. The dung name stands out as a paradox incarnate, the ruthless demolisher of sacred icons who truly believed he was fulfilling divine command. Born in the year 718 as the heir of Leo III, Constantine absorbed his father's iconoclastic zeal from a young age, viewing any depiction of Christ or the saints as heretical distractions from pure worship. As a child, he watched soldiers smash gleaming mosaics with iron hammers. I heard the anguished cries of monks dragged to their knees beneath the lash, and quietly recoiled into the shadows. Those experiences imprinted on his soul, convincing him that only by obliterating all holy images could the empire's faith be purified. When Constantine took the throne in 741 at the age of 23, he wasted no time, proving himself the true heir to his father's crusade. Before the realm could settle, a revolt erupted. His brother-in-law Artabasdos rallied the iconophile party, demanding the return of venerated images and freedom of worship. The uprising swept through the provinces like a fierce storm. Constantine deployed his legions to encircle the rebels, hunted down every stronghold, and ultimately captured Artabasdos and his son. In the midst of the hippodrome, both were blinded, eyes gouged out in the sand, the crack of whips echoing a grim verdict. Oppose heaven's decree, and this will be your fate. That decisive victory cleared the path for Constantine's most draconian measures. In the year 754, he convened the so-called Seventh Ecumenical Council at Hiera. Though its bishops were hand-picked loyalists rather than true representatives. There, the worship of images was officially anathematized as heresy, and every religious artifact from ornate mosaics and statues to illuminated manuscripts was ordered consigned to the flames. Across Constantinople, plumes of white smoke rose from funeral pyres of shattered icons, a haunting testament to faith forcibly stripped from the people. Citizens watched in forced silence as once-honoured objects turned to ash, all in the name of a purer imperial creed. In the immediate aftermath, the machinery of oppression churned into motion throughout the empire. Ancient monasteries that had sheltered thousands of monks saw their lands confiscated and repurposed as farms or garrisons. The most degrading spectacle, monks and nuns were compelled to stage mock weddings in the city square, turning their sacred vows into a public farce. Gone were the fragrances of incense. In its place, the hollow sound of mockery. Anyone caught harbouring an icon or holed up in a cloister faced shackles, torture, or execution. Spectators murmured of righteous justice, even as dread and loathing churned within them. Yet amid this sea of violence, a small band of believers stood firm. Theologian Stephen the Younger, his hair like snow, His gaze aflame became the rallying point for the underground iconophiles. Bound in chains, he still cried out psalms and defied the emperor. "I will not forsake the faith that sustains me." Legend says his nails were torn from their beds, yet his spirit remained unbroken, inspiring the fearful to believe that, though persecuted, true faith could never be extinguished. At first glance, Constantine's terror seemed to crush all opposition. But in reality, it sowed the seeds of deep resentment. Beneath a cloak of religious terror, the movement to preserve icons flourished in secrecy, images hidden behind false walls, carried discreetly in robes, prayers whispered in the dead of night. Convents became clandestine refuges, where fragments of holy art were passed hand to hand, kindling hope in hopeless hearts. In the hush beneath stone arches, the soft murmur of hymns became a beacon against the encroaching darkness. Thus, in those early years of his reign, Constantine V carved his legacy as Byzantium's scourge of sacred imagery. Chronicles speak of an empire outwardly unshakable, yet inwardly riven, a tangled web of power and belief. Whenever the wind sighed through ancient corridors, it seemed to carry the faint ring of hammer upon icon, a timeless reminder that a cause donned in righteousness today can sow anguish for countless generations to come. The cruelty of Constantine did not end with public spectacles alone. He extended his reach into the very souls of his subjects, deploying a vast network of imperial spies who watched for any hint of dissent in the quiet of private homes. A single whispered rumor could trigger a denunciation. Neighbors, once friendly, now stood ready to accuse one another of harboring forbidden images behind bolted doors. Thus, a pall of fear and suspicion settled over every street and alley, where even the softest candlelight might betray a hidden statue. The cherished custom of venerating icons, from soldiers carrying small images of Christ into battle, believing in their protective power, to mothers pausing before a painted mosaic of the Virgin Mary to pray for a child's well-being, was now branded as superstition, to be cleansed by sword and flame alike. Yet in the shadow cast by this ruthless persecution, resistance only grew more fervent. The iconophile faction, once scattered and vulnerable, formed secret repositories for holy art. Fragments of painted wood and tiny metal plaques were concealed behind false walls, buried on floorboards, or transported in clandestine caravans to remote monasteries nestled in rugged mountains. Some images even found refuge beyond the empire's borders, soft-hued icons smuggled southward into Italy, or carried across the sea to Christian communities living under Muslim rule in distant provinces. These cherished objects were often tucked into heavy cloaks, passed hand to hand beneath moonlit skies. Each bearer, recognizing fellow believers by the furtive gesture of a simple pendant, a hidden sign that said, "We share the same faith, and we remain unbroken." Women played an indispensable role in sustaining this quiet defiance. From the empress herself, whose gilded chambers had once been adorned with sacred art, to noble ladies of the court, from humble mothers to advisors seated in council chambers, women nurtured the flame of devotion in the darkest times. In the hush of grandmother's kitchen, a small icon was pressed into a child's tiny hands. In secret gatherings behind velvet drapes, whispered prayers were taught in hushed tones, coin by coin. Funds were sent to monks forced into exile, providing them with food, shelter, and copies of the forbidden texts. This web of support, though subtle, was sufficient to keep the iconophile spirit alive. Even as Constantine's agents stripped women of dowries and confiscated estates, the hidden community only expanded, its roots weaving through villages and cities alike, so that even a wealthy aristocrat's mansion could harbor the unassuming tin box of a secret shrine. As the crackdown intensified, imperial patrols swept through towns at dawn, searching beneath floorboards and behind tapestries. But for every icon seized, two more slipped through the net. In rural hamlets, entire families took turns, standing watch, their eyes scanning the horizon for approaching patrols, while children recited psalms through trembling lips. Monastic cells became underground way stations, where weary travelers found rest and refuge. Skin glowing by lantern light, as they discussed theology in whispers, the soft rustle of sandals on cold stone floors, the gentle echo of chants in hidden corridors. These became the anthem of a movement more enduring than any decree from the palace. Meanwhile, the emperor's court felt the tremors of this unseen rebellion. Rumors of hidden icon workshops, where master artisans continued to paint halos and weave gold threads into sacred cloths, reached the ears of anxious courtiers. Some whispered that the very walls of Constantinople were crumbling inward, not from age or stone, but from the weight of suppressed devotion, clamoring to be freed. Anxiety grew that within the opulent banquets and glittering halls, those seated closest to the throne might themselves be loyal to the lost icons, and thus be watched as warily as any suspected heretic. Yet the most poignant displays of defiance often came from those least expected women of gentle station who invited weary monks into their private chapels, offering them fresh bread and vinegary wine, their own hands trembling as they passed a shard of painted wood across a ragged cloth. In dusky drawing rooms, ladies of the court exchanged verses of forbidden hymns, their voices so soft as to be mistaken for the sighing wind beyond shuttered windows. They wrapped icons in delicate scarves, concealing them in the folds of their gowns, risking torture and death rather than betray the faith that gave their lives. Meaning, these quiet acts, multiplied across the empire, lent strength to the battered hearts of the faithful. In the hush of pre-dawn, in the hush of midnight, the soft flicker of candles in hidden chapels spoke of a conviction untouched by cruelty. When news of another monastery's destruction reached them, the network only redoubled its efforts, sending envoys into mountain fastnesses and across sea routes to ferry icons to safer shores. Every new painting, every restored fresco, became a triumph of the human spirit over tyranny. Thus, during the darkest years of Constantine's reign, the empire's outward might masked an inner solidarity forged in secret prayer and gentle courage. Though his edicts and armies sought to eradicate tangible symbols of faith, they could not extinguish the devotion that dwelled in countless hearts. Those who walked by torchlit streets named Constantine, the persecutor, but in hidden sanctuaries, his name was whispered as the catalyst for a quiet renaissance of belief, one that would endure long after the emperor's thunderous decrees had faded into the annals of history. In the early 70s of the 8th century, after more than 3 decades on the throne, Constantine V had transformed Byzantium into the most formidable military power since the age of Justinian. He had routed the Arab forces, subdued the Bulgarians, overhauled the civil administration, and bolstered the imperial treasury. Yet, at the very peak of his authority, a shadow began to creep across the palace walls, heralding a most dreadful denouement. In the year 770 Yeto, 3, the emperor first exhibited strange afflictions, unremitting fevers, festering sores spreading over his flesh, painful swellings that refused to subside. The court physicians, from Constantinople's finest healers to renowned Arab practitioners, were confounded, their potions and poultices offering no relief. Word of his deteriorating condition spread uneasily through the corridors of power. What began as discreet concern soon rippled into outright alarm as his body and mind betrayed erratic shifts. At times, he would issue clear, commanding decrees, rallying generals to muster the armies. At others, he'd erupt in inexplicable fury, lashing out at attendants and advisors with words sharp as any blade. Then there were the intervals of fevered delirium, when he raved without respite, chaining his own thoughts in a labyrinth of torment beyond comprehension. Once hidden behind the facade of imperial dignity, his plight could no longer be concealed, and ministers finally admitted that their sovereign was grievously infirm. Whispers of demonic retribution of a curse sent upon him for his iconoclastic zeal gnawed at the court. despite official proclamations insisting he suffered only from an ordinary malady. As the illness progressed, its cruelty intensified mercilessly. The sores deepened, devouring flesh with a slow, horrible insistence. Pus oozed from ruptured lesions, and a foul stench permeated the palace air, overpowering even the strongest incense. According to the chroniclers, sympathetic to the iconophile cause, maggots and worms took residence in the open wounds, turning the dying man's flesh into a breeding ground for decay. In the most harrowing accounts, these insects even invaded his eyes, the very organs through which he had once gazed upon holy images, with abhorrence gradually robbing him of sight. Whether these details were literal truth or symbolic exaggeration matters little. The narrative came to embody the perfect vengeance of a just deity against one who dared to defy sacred icons. In the humid gloom of his private chambers, physicians applied poultices of herbal concoctions and administered bloodletting under the emperor's orders. Yet nothing offered more than a moment's pallid respite. Courtiers, who had once jockeyed for favour in the throne room, now kept their distance from the bed, where their liege lay ravaged by illness. Candles burned low, their trembling flames reflecting off the damp stone walls and silken tapestries, once symbols of imperial opulence, hung heavy with the musk of decay. Attendants whispered behind closed doors, debating whether to conceal the truth or prepare for the unthinkable day when the empire's master would draw his final breath. As illness and rumour intertwined, a strange transformation gripped the court. Devout iconophiles saw in each fresh bandage and each tortured cry a testament to divine justice. They gathered in secret, praying that the emperor's fall would herald the end of iconoclasm and the restoration of holy images. Meanwhile, loyal soldiers and civil servants, once fierce enforcers of imperial will, found themselves questioning the righteousness of their orders. Each faltering command from the emperor's lips now carried the weight of potential ruin, should they obey a sovereign who seemed chosen by fate for suffering. Discussions in hushed tones echoed through the palace libraries and council chambers. Was it merely a malady of the body, or the work of a higher power, condemning him for trampling on sacred devotion outside the palace? Rumours of the emperor's plight seeped into the streets. Merchants and craftsmen paused in their daily labours to exchange fearful glances, and beggars in the forums raised plaintive prayers for a leader who had once crushed their own devotions. Monks in hidden enclaves spoke of visions, icons, weeping tears of blood, angels standing sentinel at the emperor's bedside. These tales, true or not, stoked the fires of piety and resistance alike. As the common folk yearned for the return of spiritual solace in the form of restored icons, by the autumn of that wretched year, Constantine's condition had become impossible to ignore. His carriage, once a symbol of imperial triumph, lay unused in the courtyard, its wheels stilled by the emperor's inability to ride. Audiences with foreign envoys were postponed indefinitely, sending diplomats back to their homelands with tales of a dying ruler whose empire trembled on the brink of uncertainty. Ambassadors reported to distant courts of Persians and Franks that Byzantium stood not as a bastion of power, but as a realm haunted by the spectre of its own ambitions and the painful irony of a leader felled by the very iconoclasm he championed. Inside the palace walls, attendants took turns sitting vigil beside the emperor's bed, chanting passages from the scriptures in hopes of miraculous healing. Yet each day brought fresh agony-fevered sweats, delirious mutterings about shattered mosaics and vengeful saints, and the relentless advance of the sores that ate away at his flesh. Late at night, the dim glow of oil lamps revealed his hollowed cheeks and glazed eyes, a once majestic visage now transformed into a pale mask of suffering. Even his closest advisers, who had enforced his policies without question, found their convictions shaken. How could they serve a ruler whose deeds seemed to have summoned such a cruel affliction? As the seasons turned, the palace grew quieter still. The once constant clamour of court protocol faded into intermittent coughing fits and the sullen drip of medicinal potions. Servants moved like shadows along yawning corridors, wary of disturbing the emperor's tortured slumber, and in the hushed stillness, the empire waited, suspended between loyalty and dread, hoping for a cure that would never come, and bracing for the moment when divine judgment and the tragic end it foretold would finally descend upon its throne. In the spring of 770 Giotto, 5, despite a body ravaged by relentless disease, Constantine V resolved to lead one final campaign against the Bulgarians. Carried upon a makeshift litter, his sores swathed in bandages and coarse cloths, he presented a ghastly sight to the assembled troops. The stench of his wounds mingled with the morning mist, and more than one hardened soldier drew back in revulsion, unsure whether fear or pity gripped them more tightly. Yet for Constantine, this ordeal was a testament to his unbroken will. He would not allow illness to be proclaimed his conqueror. In truth, it only underscored his stubborn delusion and mounting desperation. Under the tattered canvas of the command tent, the emperor's voice, hoarse and uneven, still issued edicts, as though he stood tall upon the battlements of Constantinople, even as each shouted order sounded fragile against the chorus of his laboured breathing. He commanded the arrest of suspected iconophiles among his ranks, arraigning them before makeshift tribunals. Their trembling pleas echoed into the rough-hewn timbers, an eerie counterpoint to the low, moaning wind that wove through the camp. By this act, Constantine sought to assert his dominion one last time, stamping out the defiance he believed threatened the empire's soul, even as his own flesh betrayed him utterly. When news of the advancing Bulgarian forces reached the imperial field encampment, the emperor's generals pressed forward with cautious zeal. They arranged the battle lines under grey skies, soldierly discipline in stark contrast to their sovereign's wan frame. Constantine's litter was stationed upon a slight rise overlooking the drawn swords and polished shields, and there he lingered, a silent overseer masked in bandages. It is said that banners fluttered above him, the imperial eagle barely recognizable against the swirling clouds of dust, and the faint tang of blood lingering in the air from previous skirmishes. To his officers, that tableau seemed less like a rallying point and more like a morbid monument to the futility of pride. By the middle of April, the clash came to pass. The Bulgarians struck with fury, battering the Byzantine lines with spear and arc. Yet, emboldened by their emperor's visible presence, even so frail they held firm, repelling wave after wave of assaults. Constantine watched from his litter, sweat beading through the bandages, his breath ragged as the sun rose high above the battlefield. Every victory brought him a fleeting glow of triumph, only to be extinguished by the agony that racked his body. His generals, torn between loyalty and dread, avoided meeting his eyes as they brought news of enemy retreats or fresh casualties. When the dust finally settled, the Byzantine army had won a narrow and costly success. The Bulgarians withdrew, leaving the field strewn with both sides fallen, beneath the silent stench of spent battle. Constantine issued one final proclamation to punish any who had harboured unorthodox loyalties, and to secure the frontier so no image of the saints might ever find its way back into the empire's heart. His words, intended to ring like triumph, instead fell on a startled hush. They carried the hollow echo of a man teetering on the brink of oblivion. On the 14th day of September in the same year, amid the rudimentary tents and rough-plated straw mats of the campaign camp, Constantine V exhaled his last breath. There was no gilded chamber, no resounding chorus of lamentation, only the muted murmur of soldiers at dawn, folding their cloaks against the chill air, and the low, respectful whispers of pages who dared not look upon the fallen sovereign. As word of his passing swept through the encampment, a palpable shift occurred among the ranks. The rigid lines of discipline slackened, and men exchanged uncertain glances, as though the fading light of their emperor's life left them cast adrift between loyalty and fear. When the grim announcement finally rode the winds back to Constantinople, it struck like thunder splitting a cloudless sky. Within the great palace, Courtiers staggered at the sudden void, ministers faltered in their ministrations. And soldiers, once steadfast, let unsure hands rest upon the pommels of their swords. Iconophiles, long driven into the shadows, dared to hope the end of this dark chapter, believing that divine favor now smiled upon their cause. They whispered prayers of triumph, their voices trembling with the excitement of renewal. Musicians in hidden chambers composed songs of exultation, envisioning the restoration of sacred images with notes light and soaring. In taverns and marketplaces, common folk spoke eagerly of the emperor's end. Some cackled at the ghastly tales of his final sickness, maggots writhing in festering sores, his eyes consumed by creeping worms, embellishing each retelling with new horrors. Others murmured solemn blessings, believing that in his demise, they witnessed the hand of providence delivering justice upon a ruler who had once trampled their faith. Even the most cynical bargainers and peddlers paused in their daily haggling to exchange rumors heavy with portent. Meanwhile, the camp outside Bulgarian territory grew still. Soldiers lit small fires to burn the emperor's personal effects, his battered crown, the frayed banners painted with imperial symbols, sending quiet plumes of smoke spiraling into the morning air. The scent of cedar wood and smouldering cloth hung in the dawn, mingling with the saddened groans of wounded men and the hushed prayers of the dying. A procession formed, ranks of infantry stepping in measured cadence behind a simple bier draped in dark linen. No trumpets sounded, no grand eulogies were recorded. Yet in the solemn lines of the funeral march, one could sense the end of an era etched upon each soldier's face. In the weeks that followed, rumours blossomed into legend. Iconophiles told of miraculous lights dancing around the bier as it passed, of angels visible only to those whose hearts were pure. Imperial loyalists spoke in hushed tones of the emperor's final words, uttered as though summoned by a voice beyond the grave, an oath to punish all who desecrated sacred images, even in death, through both story and silence. Constantine V's life and passing became entwined with the fate of Byzantium itself, a cautionary tale of pride and retribution, whispered by candlelight in troubled times. And so, in the stillness that follows a storm, the empire paused. The fields outside the camp lay quiet, save for the distant toll of a single bell, marking each mournful hour. Within the walls of Constantinople, a fragile calm settled over the city's heart, as though the very stones had exhaled in relief. The chapter of Constantine's life had closed one of iron ambition, relentless conviction, and ultimate despair, leaving the realm to ponder the delicate balance of power, faith, and the inexorable consequences that even the mightiest cannot escape. In the wake of Constantine's passing, the immediate task fell to his son, Leo IV. To assume a throne weighed down by turmoil, this young emperor inherited an empire battered in spirit. The armies, once unshakable under Constantine's iron command, now felt uncertain and divided. The common people eyed one another with suspicion, fearful of harboring forbidden icons, and the fervent iconoclast faction, previously relentless, found itself obliged to temper its zeal. Court ceremonies grew quieter, and proclamations against holy images were softened, no longer enforced with the same relentless fervour. While iconoclasm remained official policy, its cruel machinery ground more slowly. Its blades no longer flashed as often in the public square. Under Leo's cautious hand, the regime began to withdraw from the most savage excesses of his father's rule. Monasteries that had been confiscated gradually saw some of their lands returned, and the agent provocateurs who once prowled the streets in search of stashed icons found their orders pared back. In council chambers, ministers debated whether to revive imperial decrees or allow a more moderate approach to religious expression. The great council of bishops that once rubber-stamped Constantine's iconoclastic laws now stood silent, its resolve weakened by the memory of the emperor's gruesome end. Over time, edicts requiring the public destruction of images were quietly shelved, replaced by edicts urging caution so as not to offend legitimate sentiment, a phrase that, in practice, permitted private veneration to endure. Meanwhile, the legend of Constantine's horrific demise grew ever more potent as a tool of propaganda for the iconophiles. Theophanes the Confessor, a monk whose silvered hair and solemn demeanour lent gravity to his writings, recorded chilling descriptions of the worms that infested the emperor's flesh, and the blindness that befell his eyes once so fiercely contemptuous of sacred images. Nicetas, the Hodierna, another chronicler sympathetic to the cause of image worship, to wove accounts of miraculous weeping icons and tremors in the earth, as Constantine lay dying in his tent. Foreign historians from Persian scribes who marvelled at the moral lesson, to Arab geographers who noted it as divine retribution, to Frankish annalists. Under the Carolingian court, each added their own flourish, ensuring that word of his fate crossed empires and seas. In Rome itself, the pontiff seized upon these tales as vindication of the Western Church's opposition to iconoclasm. Clerics in St. Edi, Peter's Basilica, spoke of Constantine's end as proof that divine justice would not tolerate sacrilege, while the kings of the Franks, ever eager to assert their alliance with the papacy, echoed these sentiments in courtly proclamations. Bards composed verses praising the resilience of holy imagery, and painted manuscripts in monastic scriptoria depicted the final days of the ill-fated emperor as a cautionary tableau worms upon his skin, darkness in his eyes, the emperor humbled before a higher power. Thus, the story of his suffering became a potent emblem for political and religious allies of icon veneration, transcending its origins in Byzantine annals to shape a broader European narrative. Yet within Byzantium's borders, the legacy of Constantine's reign lived on in quieter ways. Military commanders who had once enforced iconoclastic law now found themselves hesitating before ordering another fissure in a church wall. Provincial governors, mindful of the cracks in public morale, permitted small chapels to display paintings once condemned as superstitious. Merchants returning from caravan routes brought with them tales of secret shrines in distant lands, and local artisans began to carve miniature panels depicting saints once again. Working late into the night, beneath soft lantern light, these subtle shifts spoke of an empire in the midst of spiritual recalibration, negotiating a fragile truce between authority and devotion. In the decades following Leo's short reign, Byzantine culture experienced a gradual renewal of sacred art. Frescoes in provincial basilicas regained their vibrant hues. Iconographers experimented with new techniques that blended traditional style with emerging influences from beyond the empire's frontiers. Patrons, both lay and ecclesiastical, commissioned images of Christ Pantocrator and the Theotokos, believing that these would safeguard their homes and souls alike. In the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, where once icons hung in uncertainty, new panels were installed, each brushstroke a testament to reconciliation and remembrance of the suffering that had once decimated such works. Historiography also matured during this period, as scholars sought to balance the stark lessons of Constantine's iconoclastic fervour with the pragmatic realities of imperial governance. Monastic libraries in Ithaca and Thessalonica preserved multiple accounts, those condemning Constantine's cruelty and those acknowledging his military successes, offering future generations a nuanced perspective. The emperor who had once seemed invincible on the battlefield now appeared in texts as a tragic figure, a man whose refusal to moderate his convictions had led to his downfall. Writers wove this caution into moral treatises on the limits of autocratic power, urging rulers to temper zeal with mercy. All the while, the tale of Constantine's grotesque end remained a fixture of public memory. Pilgrims to the site of his final encampment spoke of lingering whispers in the wind and the shape of a lone censer swinging in abandoned tents. Storytellers in taverns spun yarns of a phantom procession, the image of a wounded emperor pacing among the tents on moonlit nights, bandages fluttering like tattered banners, his eyes wide in eternal sorrow. Whether these were fabrications born of collective guilt or genuine hauntings, they underscored the profound impact of one man's unyielding faith. an unholy fervour that had wrought both military triumph and spiritual catastrophe. Thus, Constantine V's legacy settled into a complex tapestry. He remained celebrated for securing the empire's borders and rejuvenating its finances, yet condemned for unleashing a campaign that scarred the collective soul and provoked divine retribution, real or imagined. His life became the archetype of the ruler whose unbridled ambition and ideological rigidity invited ruin upon himself and his realm. As subsequent emperors reflected on the delicate interplay between faith and authority, they invoked his memory as a solemn warning, no matter how mighty one's power. It is vulnerable to forces that transcend mortal command. In the end, Constantine's story endured not merely as history, but as a timeless parable of pride, penance, and the inexorable verdict of divine will, reminding all who heard it that even emperors must heed the limits of earthly dominion. After the passing of Constantine V, the storm over sacred images did not immediately subside, but entered a tense interlude of uneasy transition. Leo IV, his son and heir, ascended the throne, still in youthful bloom. Confronted head-on by the harsh legacy of his father's uncompromising iconoclastic crusade. Under pressure from the court's leading factions, the military command, and senior bureaucrats, Leo found himself unable to perpetuate the previous regime's unrelenting purge. Instead, he embarked upon a series of conciliatory measures, scaling back the quotas for monastic land confiscations, granting amnesty to a number of exiled monks, and permitting the limited restoration of certain holy images under strict oversight. Though he maintained an official stance of iconoclasm, the ruthless machinery of enforcement visibly lost its momentum. Its once gleaming instruments of repression, gathering dust in the corridors of power. Yet, the unexpected death of Leo IV, after just 2 years on the throne, thrust the empire into fresh uncertainty. His widow, Irene, assuming the regency for their young son, bore the mantle of authority with an even hand. In the year 787, Empress Irene convened the Second Council of Nicaea, a grand assembly that formally overturned all previous iconoclastic edicts. This momentous decision represented a triumphant victory for the underground iconophiles who had endured decades of suppression, and it marked a public restoration of devotional order across the Byzantine world. The long-silenced call to venerate the images of Christ and the saints resounded once more throughout the empire's churches and chapels, reclaiming a sacred comfort many feared had been lost forever. Nevertheless, the imprint of Constantine's iconoclastic era persisted like a shadow across the empire's spiritual landscape. The intricate networks of thought control and religious persecution established under his rule did not vanish overnight. Imperial spies continued to relay whispered suspicions from household to household. Neighbors still eyed one another warily, recalling the days when a concealed icon could mean ruin, and the stations that had once detained defiant monks lingered on as grim reminders of past severity. Even with the formal rehabilitation of sacred images, many citizens carried with them a lingering skepticism, wariness born of decades of enforced dogma, and a cultivated fear of religious transgression. In the years that followed, the Byzantine court dedicated itself to rebuilding its image as a protector, rather than a persecutor, of the faith. Churches and monasteries that had fallen to hammers and fire under iconoclastic decrees were painstakingly restored. Artisans and craftsmen, once consigned to clandestine secrecy, now laboured openly to revive the intricate mosaics and frescoes that had long adorned sacred spaces. Their hands, guided by both memory and renewed inspiration, recreated the vibrant scenes of gospel tales and saintly icons, infusing each work with a soft glow of redemption. This wave of artistic renewal offered a balm to the empire's battered spirit, enabling worshippers to once again stand beneath painted domes and feel the embrace of their tradition. Yet, the memory of the iconoclastic rift remained etched deeply in the collective consciousness. For every restored boulder and repaired fresco, there lingered a whisper of caution, an awareness that the instruments of coercion and surveillance still existed. waiting for a chance to be wielded once again. Many people continued to regard public declarations with measured reserve, their trust in imperial directives tempered by the recollection of earlier betrayals. Religious gatherings, though freer than before, often carried an undercurrent of retrospection, as worshippers recalled the grim days when devotion itself carried the threat of torture. Amid this careful reconstruction, court officials and church leaders worked in tandem to foster a sense of unity and faith. Empress Irene herself patronized the arts, endowing scriptoria with precious pigments and commissioning illuminated manuscripts that extolled reconciliation and divine mercy. In provinces near and far, local bishops convened synods to promote theological education and encourage dialogue between former iconoclasts and iconophiles. The Church's hierarchy, mindful of its own fragility, championed a more inclusive approach, advocating for moderation in doctrinal enforcement and cautioning against any return to the zeal without compassion that had characterized the previous reign. Throughout the empire, the artistic renaissance blossomed into a full-blown revival of religious culture. New chapels rose on the ruins of desecrated sanctuaries. Bell towers once stilled began to toll again, calling the faithful to worship, and the gentle shimmer of gilded halos returned to windows and altars. In Constantinople, the great palace itself became a center for this spiritual resurgence, its halls hosting exhibitions of restored icons and scholarly debates on the proper role of imagery in worship. Pilgrims from distant lands journeyed to witness the transformation, their footsteps echoing on corridors that had once reverberated with the clang of hammers and the crackle of burning parchment. Yet, in every act of restoration, there remained an unspoken tribute to the painful lessons of the iconoclastic controversy. Each stone reset, each mosaic repaired, carried the weight of its own history, a testament to both human fallibility and the capacity for renewal. The scars left by Constantine's policies served as a perpetual warning that the imposition of belief through force could fracture the bonds between ruler and subject, faith and institution. And so, even in a time of artistic flourishing and spiritual harmony, the echo of those dark years continued to resonate, reminding Byzantium that while icons might once again glitter in the soft light of devotion, the vigilance against fanaticism must never be abandoned. The controversy over sacred images during Constantine V's reign and the subsequent restoration under Empress Irene quickly became a focal point for theologians and historians alike. Eastern Christian scholars, among them the venerable monk Theophanes, the confessor, alongside Western chroniclers such as the Frankish annalists, meticulously recorded the causes, developments, and repercussions of this turbulent debate. Works like the Chronicle of Nicaea and Testimonies of the Iconodule Party emerged as foundational references for future ecumenical councils. Leading theologians wrestled with the nuanced distinction between worshipping an image and merely venerating it, striving to reconcile deeply held religious convictions with the rational principles of Hellenic philosophy. This intellectual effort gave rise to a more robust theological framework, one designed to prevent such a crisis from repeating in later centuries. At the same time, the eerie legends surrounding Constantine's gruesome demise of maggots writhing in festering sores, of worms burrowing into his eyes, continued to circulate with lively intensity. Medieval poets and storytellers seized upon these macabre images as cautionary tales, warning not only monarchs, but all faithful people against the dangers of abusing religious power or scornfully dismissing sacred beliefs. Byzantine folk tales spoke of a weeping icon of the Virgin Mary, its painted tears of blood foretelling the emperor's horrific end, a vivid reminder that profaning the holy could incur divine retribution. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the saga of iconoclasm had found its place in the curricula of monastic schools and cathedral chapters. Young novices and clerical students learned the history of the Church firsthand, the importance of upholding the tradition of image veneration as a tangible link between earth and heaven, and the peril that awaited those who stubbornly sought to eradicate these symbols in the name of anti-superstition. This lesson, once confined to the Eastern Empire, soon spread into Western Christendom, influencing the formation of a more unified Roman Church under papal authority. In this way, the memory of iconoclasm helped shape the very foundations of medieval ecclesiastical unity and doctrine. Concurrently, Byzantine artisans began to experiment with fresh, stylistic approaches to religious art. Mosaicists and painters, having learned from past devastations, devoted themselves to the careful preservation of their works. They developed sophisticated techniques, meticulous layering of tesserae for mosaics, richly pigmented frescoes adorned with gold leaf, intricately inscribed scriptural passages on church walls to ensure that future generations might not so easily tear down or deface what had been so laboriously created. This period saw a flourishing of ecclesiastical artistry that would endure for centuries, later celebrated under the label post-iconoclasm Renaissance. Through these efforts, a resilient legacy emerged. The Church's visual heritage survived not only as a matter of religious practice, but also as an integral component of Byzantine cultural identity. Monasteries across the empire, once reduced to rubble or repurposed as barracks, were lovingly rebuilt. Their domes again, gleaming with images of Christ Pantocrator and saintly intercessors in provincial basilicas. The first renewed mosaics shone with renewed brilliance, scattering light across congregations who had long yearned to behold these sacred representations. The city of Constantinople itself, the heart of imperial power, saw its greatest churches refurnished with panels of exquisite craftsmanship. Each brushstroke an act of defiance against the memory of enforced iconoclasm. At the same time, the written word played its part in cementing this transformation. Scriptoria produced illuminated gospel books and homiletic commentaries that celebrated the return of image veneration as a triumph of faith over fanaticism. Theologians compiled treatises, balancing respect for holy images with caution against idolatrous excess, embedding within their works a nuanced vision of how icons functioned as pedagogical tools and conduits of grace. These texts circulated widely, informing future generations of clerics and lay scholars about the complex interplay between art, worship, and politics in distant lands among the Bulgars, Slavs, and Arabs who maintained contact with Byzantium. Reports of the empire's revival of sacred imagery intrigued observers. Some imitated elements of Byzantine iconography in their own religious art, while others debated the theological implications of these Eastern practices. Even in regions unaffected by the original iconoclastic debates, the story of a great civilization, wrestling with the status of images, left an indelible impression on the broader medieval world. As the post-iconoclasm Renaissance matured, a subtle but profound shift occurred. The artistry itself began to reflect a deeper spiritual realism. Faces of saints and angels gained a soft naturalism, as if the painters sought to capture not just likeness but inner character. Church mosaics adopted more dynamic composition, conveying a sense of movement and celestial grandeur. Gold backgrounds, once stark and austere, were tempered with delicate shading to evoke the interplay of divine light. Such innovations signaled an artistic confidence born of having survived doctrinal upheaval. Yet even amid these triumphs, a gentle caution remained woven into the retelling of iconoclasm's trials. Each restored dome, each revived fresco, stood not only as a monument to faith's endurance, but also as a testament to the fragile relationship between spiritual authority and individual conscience. The empire's leaders and its people came to appreciate that images, while vessels of devotion, could also become flashpoints for contention when wielded without humility. Thus, the post-iconoclasm era safeguarded both the right to venerate and the need for wise moderation, a balance that would define Byzantine worship in the centuries to follow. In this sleepy unfolding of history, one sees how a century of conflict over icons, followed by a renaissance of art and theology, reshaped the soul of Byzantium. The debates of the 9th and 10th centuries, chronicled by committed observers and rendered in vibrant mosaics and manuscripts, forged a heritage that transcended the empire's borders. They left behind a richly layered tapestry of belief and artistry, a reminder that, though images may fade and regimes may rise and fall, the yearning to connect the earthly with the divine through art endures in the quiet devotion of countless souls. The iconoclastic upheaval under Constantine V left scars far beyond the sanctuary, reshaping Byzantine culture and the arts in ways both painful and transformative. Before this era of bitter conflict, Byzantine religious art had been lushly symbolic saints. The Virgin Mary and Christ himself rendered in painstaking mosaics and frescoes that spoke of an undying faith. Yet, as Constantine's agents swept through churches and monasteries, countless 6th and 7th century masterpieces were shattered or consigned to the flames, leaving behind a tangible loss of beauty and a rupture in a venerable artistic lineage. When the veneration of images was at last restored under Empress Irene, Byzantine artisans did not simply revert to old methods. Instead, they absorbed influences from across the Mediterranean and beyond the precise geometry of Islamic art, the intricate metalwork traditions of Persian craftsmen, and the flowing motifs found among the Slavic peoples. The result was a fresh, syncretic style of mosaic and panel painting, characterized by graceful curves, brilliant hues, and gold leaf backgrounds that seemed to breathe life into sacred narratives. The schools of Thessalonica and Ravenna, in particular, flourished as vibrant crossroads of culture, their workshops producing works that would ripple outward, inspiring Christian art in the Western Balkans, and even influencing the early medieval art of Italy. Architecture, too, experienced a careful reinvention in the post-iconoclastic era. When rebuilding churches and monastic complexes, architects planned with both aesthetic grace and practical preservation in mind. Vaulted chapels were designed to shield fragile frescoes from direct exposure to rain and wind, while coloured glass windows were positioned to bathe icons and altarpieces in shifting pools of light. This period also saw the conception of the so-called heavenly corridor dome, a soaring, circular passageway beneath the dome meant to evoke the celestial realm, underscoring the connection between the earthly church and the divine canopy above. Literature of the time reflected the drama of iconoclasm and Constantine's tragic end. Clerics and scholars like Georgios Pisides composed epic poems and sermon transcripts that celebrated the steadfastness of martyred monks. These verses painted vivid scenes of torture chambers and public humiliations, yet always returned to the theme of unquenchable faith and eventual renewal. These texts, lovingly copied and carefully tucked into monastic libraries, served not only as historical chronicles, but also as spiritual exhortations, bolstering the resolve of communities still healing from decades of forced icon destruction. The entwining of art and politics during this transformative age cannot be overstated. The revival of sacred imagery under Irene's regency was as much a political statement as a religious one. It signaled the triumph of the iconophiles, bolstered Irene's own legitimacy, and reassured subjects that imperial power would no longer be wielded to crush their deepest beliefs. In Constantinople, the Hagia Sophia's once blank walls again glowed with mosaics, its domes decked with newly restored medallions of Christ and the saints. Pilgrims travelled from distant provinces to witness these resplendent restorations, affirming the capital's standing as the heart of Eastern Christian art and devotion. Even the smallest chapels in rural quarters joined in this cultural resurgence. Local guilds of tilemakers and glassworkers formed to replicate the refined styles emerging from the imperial workshops, ensuring that even remote communities could partake in the renewed visual language of Byzantine worship. Murals depicting the life of Christ or the stories of martyred saints appeared in village bishoprics, their radiant colours, a testament to faith persevering through hardship. Scholars in Constantinople's great libraries debated the philosophical and theological underpinnings of the new art. Treatises circulated on the distinction between honour paid to an image as a conduit to the divine and forbidden worship of the object itself, refinements of doctrine that sought to guard against past abuses while celebrating the restored practice. These debates echoed in the stylized minarets, glimpsed across the sea, where Muslim observers took note of the Byzantine fusion of geometry and iconography, prompting further cross-cultural exchanges that enriched both worlds. By the close of the 10th century, a distinct post-iconoclasm style had emerged, its coherence born of collective experience. The priests who stood before freshly gilded icons preached sermons on mercy and moderation, their words as gentle as the light filtering through stained glass. Parishioners, no longer haunted by the fear of persecution, joined in renewed processions, chanting hymns beneath arches newly crowned with mosaic saints. Through all these subtle yet profound shifts, the memory of iconoclasm remained a cautionary undercurrent, a reminder of how zeal, left unchecked, can fracture both heart and heritage. Yet, from the ashes of destroyed murals and broken statues, Byzantine art found a new voice, one that blended tradition with innovation, resilience with reverence. This rich tapestry of recovery and creativity would endure for centuries, ensuring that the Byzantines' devotion to sacred images remained as luminous as the gold tesserae that glittered in their cathedrals. Long after the echoes of conflict had faded into the hush of candlelit devotion, the saga of iconoclasm in Byzantium did not vanish with the closing of official chronicles or the dry pages of theological treatises. It lived on vividly in the realm of folk tales and popular piety. Among the common people, countless whispered legends circulated about miraculous statues, stories of a Mother of God icon that wept crimson tears before its destruction, as though the very saint herself lamented the sacrilege, or tales of an image of Christ that ignited with inner light during a sudden storm, its brilliance piercing the thunderclouds to forewarn the faithful of an imminent trial. One favourite narrative concerned the eve before Constantine V's final campaign. A humble monk, tending a single flickering candle in the dim cloisters, beheld the emperor's tormented spirit writhe in spectral agony. In that flicker of light, the emperor's face twisted in rapture and despair, a harrowing premonition of the inescapable death that awaited him. Such visions found their way into rustic woodcuts and puppet plays, staged in village squares. The motif of the suffering ruler rendered in jagged lines and hushed songs. It served as an ever-present admonition, ambition unchecked by reverence for tradition could summon ruin upon both leader and land. Alongside these visions, the common lore brimmed with darker portents. After Constantine's passing, villagers claimed they saw swarms of grotesque flea-like demons crawling through Constantinople's empty streets, tiny, malformed creatures that bore the shapes of infamous persecutors. Whether mere invention or shared nightmare, these insects symbolized the fear of impurity and divine retribution beyond mortal control. Such tales reminded the populace that the sacred realm was watched over by powers unseen, ready to avenge any affront to holy images or to the saints they embodied. Over the centuries, these stories crystallized into communal expression through an annual observance known as the Day of Atonement, held in several villages scattered around the old city's hinterlands. Communities erected makeshift stages in the village square, draping red and black banners to evoke the fury of those long-ago days. Actors, often local farmers and fishermen, played out stylized scenes of the imperial agents ransacking monastic cells, the desperate monks chained and blindfolded, and finally the emperor himself, his regal robe stained and torn, collapsing under the weight of his own fanatical zeal. These reenactments, though evolving over time into a crude form of pageantry, retained an instructive quality. They reminded all who watched of the perils of trampling on sacred tradition and the heavy price paid when faith is wielded as weapon. Even the simplest elements of daily life bore the imprint of these legends. Some mothers whispered the icon weeping tale to fearful children as a bedtime story, cautioning them against mocking holy images. In marketplaces, vendors would pause in their haggling to recount the miraculous glow of Christ's image amidst a tempest, invoking it as a symbol of hope that faith could shine through life's darkest storms. Shepherds returning to their flocks at dusk spoke of fleeting shapes among the olive groves, phantom icons drifting in the moonlight, signs that the traditions of old still hovered close, even in the quiet countryside. In certain monastic enclaves, the oral tradition wove itself into devotional practice. Pilgrims made pilgrimages to sites where these legendary events were said to have occurred. A ruined chapel said to hold the footprint of Mary's crying icon. A windswept hilltop, where Christ's image once shimmered amid thunder. There, humble lanterns were lit, and litanies were sung not only in formal liturgical language, but also in the rough-hewn dialects of the villagers, blending solemn prayer with the cadence of their everyday speech. The line between history and myth blurred, but the comforting conviction remained the saints, and even God himself, remained vigilant, protecting the devout and chastising the impious. As time passed and the empire evolved, the Day of Atonement festival itself took on new layers of meaning. While its roots lay in remembrance of iconoclastic cruelty, it gradually transformed into a broader celebration of communal solidarity. Villagers would decorate the stage area with fresh flowers and offer loaves of sweet bread to performers as tokens of gratitude for keeping alive the lessons of the past. Elders recited fragments of the old tales, and children listened with half-closed eyes, lulled by the slow rhythm of the storytelling. The pageant ended with a silent procession, participants carrying replicas of the once forbidden icons, their hushed steps along the rough wooden planks echoing a shared vow. Never again would they allow the light of tradition to be extinguished. In this gentle continuity of folk memory, the story of iconoclasm remained more than an academic footnote. It became woven into the very fabric of popular piety, a collection of living myths and rituals that reminded ordinary people of the delicate balance between authority and devotion. The villagers understood, in their own slow-spoken way, that icons were not merely images on stone or wood, but windows through which the divine might touch the human heart. Their annual commemorations, half solemn remembrance and half communal revelry, affirmed that the faith they cherished had weathered even the harshest storms and would endure in the quiet glow of candlelight and the murmur of age-old legends for generations yet to come. The tale of Constantine V and the iconoclastic controversy offers a profound meditation on the tangled interplay between political authority and spiritual conviction. When temporal power attempts to impose its religious will by force, it soon discovers that the human heart resists subjugation. Indeed, the more the regime strove to eradicate images, the more fervent the desire grew among the faithful to protect their cherished symbols and to find new ways of expressing their devotion. Thus began a cycle stretching across centuries where destruction and renewal coexisted as twin currents in the Byzantine soul. At the heart of this saga lies a simple truth: crushing icons by decree could never fully extinguish the creative impulse that underpins religious life. Under Constantine's harsh edicts, churches fell silent, and mosaics vanished beneath the hammer's blow. Yet in hidden corners, cellars, mountain hermitages, remote village chapels, devotees preserved fragments of glass and bits of tesserae, piecing them back together into images of Christ, the Theotokos, and the host of saints. In so doing, they demonstrated that faith, once kindled, cannot be snuffed out by mere political fiat. Instead, oppression galvanized underground workshops and secret gatherings, planting the seeds for a vibrant artistic renaissance once the storm had passed. The legacy of these events extends beyond crumbling walls and refurbished abbeys. Out of the iconoclast turmoil emerged a far stronger theological framework, one that grappled seriously with the nature and function of sacred images in worship. Subsequent councils, mindful of past excesses, codified distinctions between latreia, absolute worship owed to God alone, and proskynesis, the respectful veneration accorded to images as conduits of divine grace. This nuanced teaching, developed against the backdrop of bitter conflict, came to guide Christian practice for generations, ensuring that no future ruler could again claim absolute authority over the spiritual conscience of the people. As centuries unfolded, later synods and theological treatises, whether in the Eastern Patriarchate or in Western Christendom bore the imprint of these critical lessons. Never again would a church body rubber stamp wholesale destruction of holy art in a single edict. Instead, the memory of Constantine's iconoclastic zeal served as a cautionary exemplar. Bishops and theologians stressed that symbols are not to be worshipped as deities themselves, but rather honoured as windows through which the faithful glimpse the heavenly. This balanced outlook kept the door open to artistic expression, even in communities often scarred by prior conflicts. Today, more than a millennium on, the iconoclastic episode and its aftermath teach us that political power should never usurp the realm of personal belief. When authority oversteps into the sphere of conscience, it often sparks the very resistance it hopes to crush. Art, culture, and communal tradition respond by finding new forms, sometimes overt, sometimes clandestine, to keep their light alive. In Byzantium, this produced a resilient cycle of obliteration and rebirth in the realm of sacred imagery. But it also stimulated wider intellectual and artistic renewal. And so, the legend of the emperor, whose flesh allegedly succumbed to worms and whose sight faded under the weight of his own destructive policies, endures as more than mere folklore. It stands as a metaphorical warning power. Without humility, is never absolute. Belief, whether anchored in religious faith or in the deeper values that sustain a society, remains a force that transcends edicts and armies. The supernal realm manifested through icon, ritual, or shared moral vision acts as a counterbalance to any earthly sovereignty. Even when rulers believe they hold unchecked dominion, they discover, in time, that there are greater laws at work, laws rooted in the human spirit's unquenchable longing for meaning and for connection with something beyond itself. And in that timeless tension between power and piety, both art and faith find their truest expression. The legacy of Constantine V did not remain confined to the borders of Byzantium. It echoed through the reigns of subsequent emperors as a cautionary tale of unchecked religious coercion. When Basil I ascended the throne in the year 860 7, inaugurating the Macedonian dynasty, chroniclers and clerics alike revived memories of the iconoclastic era in their annals and in the deliberations of provincial synods. They noted, with sober reflection, how attempts to impose a singular religious vision from the imperial palace had once fractured society and driven wedges between ruler and ruled. Even though Empress Irene had formally restored the veneration of images, later decrees were crafted with greater circumspection instead of direct imperial mandates. Authority was devolved to local bishops, and open channels of dialogue were established between those who cherished icons and those who had once opposed them. In this way, the risk of reigniting the fires of discord was kept at bay. In Constantinople itself, successive regimes invested considerable effort in nurturing the bond between the throne and the church. Restoration and embellishment projects were undertaken at venerable sites such as Hagia Sophia and the Chora Church. With the Patriarchate and the imperial architects working side by side, mosaics that had once been lost to iconoclast zeal were painstakingly replaced, and new frescoes commissioned to celebrate the triumphant reunion of heaven and earth. These undertakings served dual purposes: to manifest the political authority of the emperor as protector of the faith, and to reinforce the spiritual unity of a diverse empire still mindful of past rifts. Public processions carrying newly restored icons through the marble-paved squares became annual spectacles, their slow, incense-laden rhythms fostering a shared sense of identity. While the liturgical calendar was enriched with feasts honouring the saints whose images had once been contested, at the same time, the story of iconoclasm and Constantine's grim fate continued to be woven into the fabric of aristocratic family lore and the curriculum of monastic schools. In noble households, elders recounted at banquets the legend of the emperor consumed by affliction, his flesh said to be ravaged by worms, an unsettling reminder of the perils of trampling on sacred tradition. Young pages listened in hushed awe, their reflections echoing in the grand halls of the palace. Meanwhile, in cloistered classrooms, novice monks studied excerpts from Theophanes' Chronographia and the Liturgia Basilike, texts that preserved the perspective of the devout and ensured that the memory of religious suffering would not fade into obscurity. Through these oral and written means, the Byzantine people preserved a collective memory that blended historical fact with moral instruction, shaping a national identity rooted in resilience and learned caution. Even beyond the capital, provincial bishops and abbots upheld this tradition. In lecture halls of distant monasteries, students pored over illuminated manuscripts recounting small local councils called in the wake of Basil's early rule assemblies, convened to reaffirm the proper place of icons and to prevent any resurgence of imperial overreach. The roles of the laity and the clergy in safeguarding the Church's visual heritage were emphasized, forging a practical ethos. The defense of faith must be a shared responsibility, not the privilege or burden of the emperor alone. In the workshops of artisans across the empire, the memory of iconoclastic destruction spurred a renewed dedication to craftsmanship and conservation. Even the simplest village chapel, restored or newly built, bore witness to this ethos. Tile makers crafted vivid ceramic medallions. Glassmakers blew colourful windows that filtered the sun into patterns of light. And stonecutters carved inscriptional bands recounting the Church's trials and triumphs. Each piece of decorative art, no matter how small, they was marked with an understanding that these works were more than mere ornamentation. They were vessels for communal memory, as crucial to social cohesion as the creeds proclaimed at the altar. Ultimately, the tale of Constantine V's iconoclastic zeal and Irene's restoration passed down through a tapestry of liturgy, historiography, and folklore, combining the solemnity of sacred text with the intimacy of fireside storytelling. It reminded each new generation of Byzantines that political authority must walk hand in hand with spiritual humility, and that the heart of a civilization lies as much in its capacity to honor shared beliefs as in its power to enforce them. Even as fleeting empires rose and fell, the memory of those turbulent decades remained etched in stone and parchment, teaching that the true strength of a society is measured not by the might of its armies, but by the depth of its faith and the wisdom with which it balances power and piety. Across the sweep of a millennium marked by cycles of ruin and renewal, the story of Constantine V and the trauma of iconoclasm delivers a profound message on political power. However resounding or formidable, can never coerce the human heart and mind into relinquishing sincere faith. When we recall the image of sacred statues shattered to rubble, followed by the quiet resolve of worshippers who safeguarded each fragment, we come to grasp the latent strength within true belief. The emperor's tragic fate with its harrowing consequences, from festering ulcers to the legend of his submission before supernatural judgment, stands as a silent admonition that violent imposition of conviction only stokes the fervour to preserve it. In the shadows of repression, innate lies emerged, secret devotion flourished, and a more resilient theological foundation took root. From this saga, we draw a vital lesson. The real might of a society does not lie in the sword or in edicts issued from a gilded throne, but in the dignity of its people and their capacity to sustain belief and cultural values amid upheaval. Today's reflection calls us to recognize the importance of humility in leadership. A discerning government will heed the voice of conscience rather than sow fear. A wise community will protect its spiritual heritage when it faces the threat of erasure. When power ultimately encounters the frontier of inner conviction, what stands firm? It is fidelity to the deepest values, the enduring bond between humanity and the transcendent, regardless of any trial. Through this video, we learn that whenever authority forgets its humanity, culture and art become the guiding lights that uphold communal identity. Empathy and respect for belief form the lasting glue that helps prevent a recurrence of the upheaval once endured by Byzantium. Let faith and creative expression lead the way, ensuring that age-old legends and teachings serve not merely as stories of the past, but as guiding principles for action today and for generations to come.